Hello everyone, and welcome to a brief history of journalism in America. We've got a lot to cover, so let's go ahead and get started. Our story begins in 1690 with the publication of the first American newspaper, Public Occurrences, in Boston, Mass. Although it lasted only one issue, it marked the start of the journey of journalism, pun intended. 100 years later, after we've reached independence, the U.S. passes the Bill of Rights, and with it, the First Amendment. The First Amendment is very popular, but I just want us to focus on the part where it says, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. And while it doesn't prevent you from getting beaten up for saying something offensive, it at least protects the government from trying to hush up what you're saying. In 1849, about 60 years after the Bill of Rights is passed, a group of 6 European publishers come together to form an organization to bring news from across the pond. It would eventually become the Associated Press. Today, the Associated Press has 1,700 newspaper sources and 5,000 TV and radio organizations in its membership. With 1883 comes the introduction of one of our famous figures, Joseph Pulitzer, who buys his first newspaper company. You might recognize the name from the Pulitzer Prize, but Pulitzer was one of the controlling bodies in news that eventually came up with sensationalism, or exaggerating the truth to make it seem more dramatic and newsworthy. In 1895, another famous figure surfaces, William Randolph Hearst, who buys a newspaper company that would become the New York Journal. Hearst and Pulitzer would eventually become something like rivals in the news business, trying to come up with more and more sensational stories in order to outsell the other. In 1898 comes a big fiasco, the mysterious explosion on the USS Maine in Cuba, in which the ship sunk. Because the cause of the explosion was a mystery, most people blamed Cubans and ultimately Spain. During this time, both Hearst and Pulitzer covered the stories with half-truths. These stories that were half made up would eventually be called yellow journalism. In the early 1900s, while Teddy Roosevelt was president, came a new type of journalism that we refer to today as investigative journalism. At the time, these journalists were called muckrakers because Teddy Roosevelt disapproved of their willingness to get down to the nasty truth of things that he would have rather covered up. The picture you see here is a political cartoon covering the meat scandal in Chicago, where unsanitary and often dangerous practices were used in meatpacking factories. Upton Sinclair wrote a book about the practices called The Jungle, which would lead to the revolution of the meatpacking industry and the formation of the FDA, also known as the Food and Drug Administration. In 1934, after World War I and just before World War II, the U.S. increased regulation of radio broadcasting by founding the Federal Communications Commission, also known as the FCC. More TV stations would begin broadcasting after World War II was over. Good job, guys. Now, y'all ready for some hot tea? In 1971, the New York Times published some classified government Vietnam War documents. Nixon, the president at the time, didn't like this and tried to get a restraint on the newspaper. However, the Supreme Court sided with the newspaper as there had been no prior restraint when publishing or obtaining the documents. Later in the same year, reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein covered a burglary at the offices of the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, in Washington, D.C.'s Watergate Hotel, pictured here. They eventually linked the break-in to a secret campaign led by advisors to President Nixon to try and artificially win the next election. This led to his resigning from the presidency in 1974. This right here is a picture of President Nixon, who was quoted in his resignation speech as saying, "I am not a crook," and "America needs a full-time president." Now, at about the same time, the Vietnam War was being broadcast all across America. As this was the first televised war, people were seeing for the first time live, full-color videos being broadcast into their living rooms of war. Because of this, people disliked that we were at war, and with some failures in Vietnam, this eventually led to the U.S. retreating. The early 90s gave birth to unrestricted use of the internet and the World Wide Web, which connected websites together. In 1998, Google starts up, allowing people to search the internet for specific websites and eventually images, like this one. Today, Google provides services that allow people to search for videos, specific products, and local updates. September 11th, 2001 was infamous for the attacks on the Twin Towers and on the Pentagon. It wasn't since Pearl Harbor since America experienced a personal attack that caused this much carnage. Thus, this event basically broke journalism. Newspapers and reporters were scrambling to report the historic event that would later go down in infamy. By 2012, the digital revolution fostered a mobile age. Half of all American adults at this time own a smartphone, and a quarter own a tablet. Cars can connect to the internet. Wi-Fi allows people to be connected wherever they are, allowing for live updates, bloggers, and even social media reporters. News is at the fingertips of all Americans. And that's all I've got for you guys. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, or at least learned something from it. Please comment if you have any questions below.